Well, hello there, and this just in, the numbers are also in because the first 2 weeks, actually, let's say, of Mythic Plus has been accumulating a lot of data over who is the best DPS in the game, where are all the S tiers, who is at the bottom of the barrel, with the caveat that it is the beginning of the season. Not everybody has their tier sets, not everybody that has their tier sets plays Mythic Plus, and vice versa, and so on. So let's get that out of the way. With the former king, Frost Death Knight, will it retain its king? No, it's not. Dude, Frost DK is down bad. It's probably nobody's surprise, really. The tier set was decently good last year, plus a bunch of stuff has been kind of slightly, maybe a little bit reworked, not too much. But the new version of Frost DK that has seen very few changes is not just great almost at all so far. Insofar as we know, because, you know, it's still very early and Unholy DK is doing a little bit better, which means that most good DPS DKs are probably playing Unholy at the moment. So we'll have to come back in like a month or something to see the evolution. But Frost DK is around C tier in terms of overall performance, in terms of the keys being cleared so early into the season. And we'll see if that eventually changes. I have very little hopes that it will, because the tier set of its nature just doesn't really favor big Breath of Sindragosa playstyles that we've had last year, which was what prompted Frost DK to be so good. But the meta always change, and what are you gonna do? Meta is meta. There's also a meta way to have a career in programming with today's sponsor, Boot.dev, an online learning platform that will teach you backend web development from start to finish with the languages Python and Go. If you are like me, you might get bored easily, which is why I change my WoW mains every patch to keep things fresh, and it's the same with learning new things. But if I can turn lessons into quests that, when completed, award me with experience points and level up to earn achievements, then learning pretty much anything becomes way more interesting. And yes, I'm talking about how the Boot.dev people approach their system of teaching people how to code. Yes, everything is like one big RPG game, and you even have leaderboards to gauge your progress relative to other people. And all of this is packed with a lot of coding exercises that get you to actually engage with programming a lot, since at the end of the day, writing a lot of code is the way to learn coding, on top of doing it in an interesting way that doesn't get you bored along the way. As gamers, we are usually more familiar with the IT market and how lucrative it can be for programmers. But if you needed a refresher, a survey made by Stack Overflow in 2023 showed that the median salary in US for a backend web developer was over $165,000, which in today's numbers would put you around the top 6%-ish of US income earners. That is not too shabby, actually. And the Boot.dev guys are making the whole learning process super accessible. All of the content is free to read and watch in guest mode if you are undecided yet. And if you do decide to start learning seriously, there is a 30-day money-back guarantee if you feel this is not worth it for you. Start your learning journey by clicking the link in the description, which will get you 25% off of your first subscription, whether it is a monthly recurrence or yearly one, or simply just use our code Marcelian Online whenever you purchase your first subscription. You will, of course, also be supporting the Marcelian Online team to make more videos while taking the next step in your programming journey. Thank you, Boot.dev, for sponsoring our video. Back to Unholy Death Knight, as I mentioned, it is doing significantly better than Frost DK. I'm gonna put it all the way into A tier. The damage is really good. Sand Lane is definitely prompting Unholy DK to go up in the meters and up in the rankings altogether. Once again, it is fairly early, and from what I understand, it is a little bit reliant on power infusion, which to many people's chagrin, it's not very fun in terms of, you know, being reliant on external power systems when it comes to performing properly and getting out your rotation. But that's mostly in single target. In terms of Mythic Plus, DKs are very, very welcome in this meta of super melee unfriendly with a lot of melee mechanics and having kind of a need to be a little bit at range. Havoc Demon Hunter is seeing better days. Thank God, finally, as the potential main that I could have had. Havoc is currently doing better than the current main that I have, and I'm not salty whatsoever because it deserves it. It's been quite a while since Havoc has done so well for itself in any form of content whatsoever. I think we're going on the 3rd year right now with Havoc being very bad, and now we're just seeing it resurface to the A tiers of the pushers of the keys, so much so that it could actually go all the way into S tier. You're gonna see a graph at the end of the video when it comes to how the evolution of each spec's performance while climbing into keys develops, and Havoc is one of the melees that kind of stands toe-to-toe with the best ones, and considering that it's probably nobody's surprise, and we've called it a range meta this season, you're probably going to benefit a lot from having that Havoc debuff if Vengeance kind of trails off for whatever reason. But with that out of the way, rejoice Havocs, enjoy the spotlight. Not as big of a spotlight as Balanced Druid has, currently for the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th season in a row being S tier, or at least close to being an S tier spec. Balanced Druid is just really well designed for Mythic Plus, period. Its kit just really matches with big AoE pools, very efficient damage profiles, very, let's say, unconditional damage output. I mean, you're conditioned in the sense that you kind of have to have your dots up on everything to be able to actually do proper damage, and tabbing Moonfire 10,000 times is very fun and engaging gameplay. But outside of that, you're not like a Distro Warlock where everything needs to be set in one place, or similar to Frost Mages, not really like Fire Mages either, where you kind of have to be slightly bunched up together. Balance just has a flexibility in its dealing damage portion of its rotation where no other specs can really compete. Not to mention that the Druid kit is actually very strong this season, by the way, and Balance is at this point the strongest Druid spec to push keys, but with the other ones being very close. Speaking of Feral Druid, now this is a little bit difficult because on one hand, the top Feral Druid, or the top Feral Druids by the time you watch this video, are pushing keys close to Balance's level. I think the top keys that are being cleared right now, as of recording this video, is plus 15s. 1 or 2 15s, and that's about it. We haven't actually touched 16s yet. And Ferals are there also, together with Balance. There's more Balance players, and probably Balance does way more damage than Feral, but Feral is still there. So I don't know what that means. Feral still has a lot of damage potential, so it could just be more coming. I really want to rank Feral higher, but if we're going to be fair across the board and we're going to be looking at Mythic Plus scores and overall keys cleared, Feral is being like propped up by a couple of really good players, but the majority of the Feral community is not pushing the spec as high as possible, which is why it is B tier. But I do want you to understand that the very top Feral Druids are at least A tier. We'll see how that progresses. It's going to be very interesting going into the next couple of months, because Feral has had some of the most amount of damage output on the PTR, even more so than Shamans sometimes. So I'm kind of surprised that it's only up as far as it is at the moment. Big surprise, Devastation has also taken a turn for the better, and it's also, do I put it? I think I put it in front of Feral. Following the death of Augmentation, Devastation is actually seeing people play it for the first time in 2 years, because nobody has touched this spec almost ever since it has been released, and now it's doing really well. Actually, probably better than the tier list would indicate. Devastation is actually a very high premier DPS spec, one of the highest damage outputs in the game, more damage than even some of the A tier specs, but I digress. It's still a little bit chaotic at the moment, at the beginning of the season. And Devastation is of course providing the Evoker benefits that Augmentation used to provide that you might not need now, considering that the value of Evoker was basically in its Augmentation kit. But it's very happy days for Devastation. A big difference from being the bottom of the tier list and now to being above average, I would say. Okay, I did not expect this next one to still be S tier. I kind of have to put it in front of Balance. And the reason I did not expect it is not that I was oblivious to its damage on the PTR. I have been there, by the way. I have seen it in action, and it was crazy. I was 110% convinced it's going to be nerfed. And it's likely going to be nerfed. I'm sorry for jinxing it. After the race world first ends, I would imagine probably before the big MDI season practice starts. I mean, I hope it won't be, but it's doing like significantly better than a lot of the other specs. And unless we're seeing buffs to like 14 specs on this list, then BM was probably gonna have to be taken down a notch. I am happy, to be honest, for BM to be so good, and it's been a while since this happened. Was it end of BF? No way it was end of BFA. The last time BM Hunter was S tier spec was quite a bit ago. But now BM is back and crushing the meters. Glad to see Hunters in any capacity being at the top of the tier for any reason whatsoever, because Hunter, as with Warrior and maybe DK, but not as much, they don't really have a really good Mythic Plus kit. Oh, Warlock as well. I forgot about Warlock. So seeing a class that doesn't really have a good kit for Mythic Plus actually be S tier, even A tier, is a really good thing. Not something I can say about marksmanship, bro. This is maybe the biggest disappointment of today's tier list. Okay, as you can probably see on the screen right now, the top marksmanship hunters are clearing keys pretty high. So people like to look at these tier lists and think, oh my god, it's D tier. You never invite these into your group, bro. The best marksmanship, or let's say your average marksmanship one-trick pony, is probably going to smoke you in terms of overall performance. Marksmanship is good. It definitely lacks single target damage, and that is a big no-no when it comes to pushing high keys, considering that bosses usually tend to be the point where people get stuck on the most, because otherwise outside of bosses you just need to survive. Everybody just has so much AoE damage nowadays that that's not even a question or a problem. But with the rework of marksmanship, a couple of major faults have been pointing out, and now that is with the choice node of trick shot and aspect of the Hydra, where the devs really wanted to make sure that, you know, you can actually cleave onto targets. You're still not ever taking aspect of the Hydra, because there is no real situation at any point in time where you're only going to fight 2 targets and not more. That's so specific that I don't know exactly how this can function and repair marksmanship. Something like maybe make aspect of the Hydra do more single target damage as well, so it would be a clear choice between it and trick shot, and maybe that can also up its single target period. I do actually expect marksmanship to be buffed, because it is unheard of for a spec rework to perform so poorly that almost nobody plays it. Obviously people play it, obviously people are doing keys, but you know what I mean, as opposed to something that, you know, let's say Red had when it initially got reworked. In a kind of similar situation, Survival is also doing very poorly. And Survival kind of also has been reworked in a sense, with Pack Leader and a bunch of talents being changed. It does not show that it was for the better. Although, once again, this could be at the beginning of the season. People are probably rocking at most 660 item level at the moment. The pure grinders, I mean, we are about at 650-ish, and we're, you know, raiding Heroic and Mythic at the moment and doing plus 10s. So I don't know how this will look at 678 or over 670, essentially, when everybody's going to have their best, their myth track gear, their best trinkets and all of that stuff. I don't know if that will prop Survival and of course other specs as well up the tiers, but as it is and as it stands now, it is incredibly poor in terms of overall performance. But it could also be the fact that it's vastly outshined by Beast Mastery, similar to Marksmanship, where they are literally at the polar opposites of this tier. So if you are a hunter and you want to push keys to make it into let's say a ranking of any kind, you're probably playing Beast Mastery at this point, which even skews the difference between these two more and more. Arcane also has seen a big dip ever since season 1. Also kind of being a little bit reworked, also suffering from an identity crisis and a damage profile crisis, and I don't know what kind of crisis Arcane has to go for it to finally be the same spec for at least a season consecutively. But as it stands, it's just not doing too well at all, and similar to Hunter, it's gonna be a little bit outshined by the other mage specs. Arcane is just a weird spec. It's fun. I really dig the War Within versions, but it's just all over the place. And I feel like the devs are just like, okay, bro, we just don't know what to do with it. Just whatever. D tier, fine. Just see you next season. I feel like that's how Arcane is at the moment, which is a stark contrast from how it was when it was reworked in beta, where every week it seemed like there was another rework for Arcane. But now we're probably seeing why that happened and why that isn't such a great thing in the end, when you just cannot nail what Arcane is supposed to do. And if we don't know what Arcane is supposed to do, we're hardly going to be able to make it do anything consistent, which is the case right now. Much to my dismay, Fire Mage is currently S tier. Well, actually, not really. I'm fine. Listen, I've been of happy Fire Mage Season 1, and it's great that Fire Mage is doing really well Season 2. It's been changed a little bit, buffed a little bit, reworked slightly, cannot really call it a rework, but the scaling, the gear, and everything else is just making Fire Mage a lot better. Of course, Fire Mage is better for almost the same reasons that it has always been S tier before. It has probably the best damage profile in the game, when you can just convert your pure single target damage into actual decent cleave on enemies. You're not giga AoEing, of course, but that's why you have, let's say, a balanced druid for. And some of the highest, if not most of the highest keys are done with a balanced druid and a fire mage, and this feels like deja vu all over again. Bro, can we have other specs be S tier, dude? I don't know, maybe not Frost Mage, because Frost Mage has also dipped a little bit more depending on where you're watching your rankings. WarcraftLogs, I feel like it's not WarcraftLogs, Archon rather. I feel like it bumps Frost Mage all the way to the bottom, but it's not actually that bad. It could also be the fact that some of the top mages are still probably playing Frost at the moment, and they're kind of doing a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to the ranking of Frost Mage in regards to everybody else on the tier. It could be that people just swap from Fire to Frost occasionally, and they can just be in kind of the same key levels with their own group, so maybe that's also the case. But as it stands, Frost Mage is around B tier. Its damage has taken a hit going into Season 2 from what we've been able to see, and it's definitely reflected in the overall ranking performance. But don't forget, being at the top of the B tier means you're still above average, so that doesn't mean that it's a bad spec. It just means that it's no longer top A tier, bottom S tier like it was last season. Windwalker, my current main, is doing also well in raids and not at all well in dungeons. Well, it's probably a little bit better than in the past, where it's, let's say, average or slightly below average as opposed to decently below average. Cannot really say too much about Windwalker. It has some significant changes with Conduit of the Celestials, where now it's actually doing really good damage, a lot of burst, which is something that you definitely would need overall. But that does mean you're going to go heavily into Mastery and Haste, and usually the high key pushes, especially melees that take a lot of damage, you probably want Versatility to be a stat that you would go for, and I don't know if that will make Windwalker essentially better. If it does end up more heavily into versatility, if it ends up playing Shadow Pan later on, as it stands right now, is just really solid. The Monk Utility Kit is pretty good. Detox is really good. The Paralysis and Rage Dispel is also really good. You can have ring skips again with Theater of Pain and things like that. Possibly even priority depending on what your route is. I think the routes are still being developed right now, so nobody really knows anything at the moment. Its damage is really good. In its AoE build, it still does some of the highest single target boss damage, which is really good for a spec when it comes to Mythic Plus. Part of the reason why Fire Mage is also so good. Now, I cannot really put them in the same boat. They're leagues apart in terms of overall performance, but it's looking better for Windwalker than it has been for a while, so we can only hope that it does better as the season progresses. Red is still standard. Well, actually, no, red has dipped a little bit. It is the spec that clears the most keys, period, because it's the most played spec in the game at the moment, at least the Mythic Plus, probably in red as well. We'll see that next week or in 2 weeks. Red Paladin is just very, very solid, considering that Pro Paladin has taken a dip and Holy Paladin is down bad in the Shadowlands. You're probably going to get your Paladin utility from Red Paladin before anybody else. That doesn't mean Pro Paladin is bad, but, you know, we'll leave that for another time. Red Paladin is just very, very solid. It has a lot of damage, and it was actually really good at the beginning last week. Now it's kind of dipping a little bit. It could be that everybody else is just getting better gears and better tiers and better trinkets. I do assume that Red will probably climb a little bit to A tier, since with some of these melees, for instance, Red Paladin has some of the best damage output, obviously from a good weapon that applies pretty much with all melees. But some of the best weapons for Red Paladins are coming from the last boss of the raid. Galliwix is not that easy on Heroic, and it's definitely not even killed on Mythic yet as the race to World First still progresses, meaning that some of the top reds that would be clearing the highest of the keys ever to kind of duke it out with the likes of the mages and the boomkins of the world are not geared enough to be able to compete. And that applies to a lot of other specs, not just Paladin, but I guess this is as good a point as any to make that distinction. So don't fret. We'll see. We'll be back here in about a month or so to see where Paladin is. Shadow Priest, though, the resurgence. Oh my god. I am actually happy to see specs that have been so underperforming for the longest time to come back into the fold with A tier. I think it's because Augmentation has taken a dip. Nah, that's probably because of the big fat damage that Shadow Priest has. And good for you, Shadow Priest, you deserve it. Not to mention, Mass Dispel is pretty good, Stamina Buff is pretty good, Dispels in general are pretty good, Mind Soothe are also really good, then that's about it. I don't think that's pretty much it. And considering that the best healer this season so far as of recording this video is Discipline Priest, you're probably not getting your Shadow Priest because of its kit. No. It's the damage. It's really good damage. Happy for you. Assassination is also average. Close to Windwalker, actually. It could also be an issue of gear, could also be an issue of beginning of the season. It's still better than, you know, its historical place at the bottom of the tier list. It was way better in Season 1 for sure. It didn't really get nerfed in Season 2, so you cannot really say that it's just not balanced properly. It might just be a combination of the tier set, might be a combination of the type of dungeons and the dungeon pool that we have, where they don't really take advantage of Assassination's forte, although if Fire Mage can do it, Assassination should kind of likely do it. However, we have so many mechanics that break you from your target that will make specs like Assassination really suffer, where you want to maintain that uptime on the target, as with most specs, but particularly so with Assassination, especially if you're going into your damage windows, and that actually applies to all rogue specs, Outlaw as well. Now, see, so we look at the data for pretty much everybody pushing keys when it comes to the top 10 of each spec. Outlaw is one of them as well, and Outlaw for some reason is just ranked really highly, but I feel like Assassination is probably a better spec. I don't know. It could be the fact that Outlaw is just on the comeback. It's making a return to actually being a really good spec for Mythic Plus, and it hasn't been the case since Dragonfly Season 3, so about 2 to 3 seasons ago. And to be fair, listen, Outlaw had a lot of spotlight in the past, so it's not that bad. But Outlaw is just a really good spec for keys. Now, it depends on how you do those keys, because once you do Cinder Brew with big pools, Outlaw is just going to trail behind with its AoE cap, similar to a lot of other specs on this tier list. But it's still a very efficient spec, since you can just essentially convert all of your single target into AoE. Very easy with just the push of a button, which is the marker of a good Mythic Plus spec. Surprisingly, Subtlety is back, very back actually, also back that it's front of the A tier at the moment, in front of Havoc Demon Hunter. Subtlety has kind of suffered for quite a bit, where it was actually at the bottom, if it wasn't actually the worst DPS spec in the game currently in Mythic Plus Season 1 of The War Within, and probably Season 4 of Dragonflight, if I recall. If not, it was just very bad. It's still kind of poop when it comes to Black Powder, which is one of its main AoE sources. I need to also check, this is just so many specs, I need to check what Subtlety rogues are playing in dungeons, but I believe it would be Trickster, since it's just an efficient way to deal AoE damage. It would be the way to actually push keys, because it turns your single target into AoE. But so far, hey, glad to see Rogue back up in the mix, and Subtlety is one of my favorite specs, so yay for Rogue. Elemental Shaman, cranking. Now, I know that you liked seeing all of these A tier specs being top of the A tier specs, but it's time to knock them down a peg, because Elemental is cranking so much so that I was considering putting it into S tier. There are a couple of really good Elemental Shamans that are crushing in Mythic Plus right now, Petco being one of the most famous ones, I would imagine. And they're doing really high keys, but once again, these are just very few select people that are pushing the spec to new levels, and not the entire community of the spec. It has the potential to be S tier, and it might even make it into S tier by the time we revisit this meta tier list. But as it stands right now, I kind of want to put it at the top of the A tier, because it's just lacking a couple of the high dungeon clears that the S tier specs have. Similarly to Enhancement, I don't think we've had Elemental and Enhancement be this close together in a very long time, or almost ever. Now, in terms of overall score, it feels like it's slightly behind Elemental, but in terms of the keys cleared, I think it clears one key higher, but that's basically like 1 or 2 people playing Enhancement that are doing that. So once again, if I'm not going to rank Elemental based off of its top 1 to 2 players, I'm not going to do that for Enhancement either. So it's going to be top of the A tier. But once again, these specs are really good, very high potential to be S tier specs. And most people that are around this level in this tier list are people that already have their 4 set. So I don't know if we're going to see bigger difference in their overall ranking. Affliction, bro, I think Affliction will never make it into the top rankings of almost any tiers whatsoever, maybe a little bit in raids. I don't know what to say, man. Affliction is one of my favorite Warlock specs and is one of my favorite range specs to play. I'm not a big fan of Malefic Rapture. The entire community, or at least the majority, are not fans of Malefic Rapture. They're not fans of the damage profile that Affliction has. They're not fans of the fact that Vile Taint has a longer cooldown than the Dust Take to be reapplied. So essentially your agony just drops off before your Vile Taint comes back off cooldown. And this is a consistent issue with Affliction that will cause a big discrepancy in its overall damage profile. You don't want to tap target spam agony when a pack has 5% or 10% less HP, but you don't want it to drop either because you're not doing any more damage. And even if you do tap target eventually, it's just you're not balanced Druid, you're not applying your dots as efficiently, and you think Malefic Rapture is enough. Sometimes it can be, sometimes it's just so not enough, and the fact that you're such a hard cast spec in general will make it particularly difficult to keep up with everybody else, even if you did have the damage. But it's not really with the damage there either. Definitely not as much as Demo, which it's doing slightly better, but not by too much as well. I have seen Demo Warlocks actually do crank a little bit, so I'm not sure that they do truly belong into C tier, but we will actually revisit this once we go further into the tier. Cannot really say a lot about Demonology. Most of the time, Warlocks are just a matter of having enough damage or not, because their kit is very lackluster for dungeons. Gate skips are very far in between. Hellstones are definitely good. The Battle Resurrect ability is the worst in the game. It has one of the longest casts ever for a spec that's already incredibly immobile, and putting yourself into a secure place to also cast takes so long. So there's hardly ever a really good reason to get a Warlock into a dungeons. As much as I would love to see more Warlocks, they're just not designed really well for dungeons at all. So the only time that they really shine is when they have the damage, which is probably why Destro is seeing decent play as one of the top tier specs. I think it's in front of Feral actually. It's one of the top tier specs in general. It has some of the most infinite AoE scaling, or kind of the only infinite AoE scaling if you want to take it that way, until the devs crack down on it because they don't like that for some reason. But that is kind of like the only reason why Destruction would be realistically picked into very high keys, which is why you see it occasionally in MDIs when people play lower level keys, not the ladder keys, where they can just pull a lot more packs than they normally would do. That's when specs like Destruction will see a lot of play, but that just means that, you know, it has its niches, and that's not that bad actually. Being the best at like one particular thing is better than just being average at all of the things, my opinion, and until that changes, Destro is probably still gonna be average. Arms Warrior is doing really well for itself actually. After also being nerfed, it's still pumping really hard. Average spec at the moment. It is a warrior spec, like I mentioned before, and warriors are just not faring very well in general because their kit is just not made for dungeons. Like I mentioned for warlocks, like I mentioned for hunters. So unless you just give them a crap ton of damage, they're not gonna do well. And they had a crap ton of damage, and they were way better a week ago, I believe, but they since have been taken down a peg, and obviously they were really good in beta as well. I might be conflicting the first week of season 1 with the last weeks of PTR because I've been kind of interchanging between the two quite a bit. Arms is not doing too shabby, but then again, you're not going to bring a lot of value to your group, period, and you're also a melee in a range meta. At most, you might do as well as Fury as one of the top melees in the game currently. Not keeping up with, let's say, the enhances and the havocs and the subtleties of the game, but it's definitely doing a little bit better considering where it came from season 1. It's good to see Fury back in the game because that's usually what B tier list rather is. It's just specs that are just really good overall. All of these specs have cleared 12s, I believe, around there, 12, 13s at the very most. Some of these for sure, so they're not doing too bad. Plus Fury is usually a spec that really wants a lot of high level, and we'll see how that performs against all the other specs in the list as well. And the issue that Red Paladin had when it comes to its weapons, Fury also has, of course, but Fury has 2 weapons that it needs. So by the time Fury actually gets some fat chunkers, we might see it just at about average. And last but not least, it has happened, ladies and gentlemen. For the first time since it was released, Augmentation is done. Woo, woo, woo. I am not very happy that a spec is just terribly bad, and not just bad, but terribly bad, because there are definitely people there that like to play it, and I don't really want people to not have fun in the game. That's just being silly. But it just cannot work in the game. And I was a big proponent of augmentation being broken, because I figured, okay, if we have a niche spec with niche utility like support and stuff, be really good, but frustrating people a lot, that will definitely drive enough attention to it that the devs will kind of take another look at the overall composition of parties and raids and things like that. Parties in this sense, because we're talking about Mythic Plus, and kind of revise and modernize the WoW game in general, whether it's from its encounter design, from the utility that certain dungeons want, from what synergies you can have between specs. I figured that that would be the best thing for the game, with augmentation being such an overwhelming force. But it hasn't happened for 2 years. So just kill it at this point, because I am so bored of actually seeing augmentation in every group. Of course, we're kind of back to how it was before augmentation came back, so I don't know if it's any better, but at least it's something different than what we've had in the last couple of seasons. I really do hope that augmentation isn't killed off. It's still doing decent keys. Obviously, it's still a decent DPS spec, but it's nowhere near where it was before, and let's say that Devastation needs a little bit of spotlight, so augmentation can sit comfortably in the D tier with all of the other D tier specs that have made this tier their home. But this is how the meta is looking at the moment, and what you're probably seeing right now on the screen is the evolution of the specs and how they approach Mythic Plus when it comes to, you know, the popularity rather, because what you're seeing right now is the parses of each spec as the key level goes higher and higher and higher, and once it reaches some of the endpoints of this graph, you'll see exactly what kind of specs actually dominate the end game content as of this recording of this video. So this is kind of a little bit neat in this sense, but WoW is definitely changing for the better, and it's only looking better as we go forward. And if you're not convinced, that's because you haven't watched our 11.1.5 video, where we actually tell you why WoW is so much better in the future. And now too,